Welcome to Beyond Imagination, the future of creative technology, presented by Technicolor Creative Studios. I'm your host, Isabelle du Plessis, Global PR Director across The Mill, MPC, Mikros Animation, and Technicolor Games. In this special edition podcast season, we'll be talking to leading figures across the creative technology space about evolving trends that are shaping the future of filmmaking, gaming, advertising, animation, innovation, and talent. Today, I'm joined by a host of animation experts from Mikros Animation to discuss gender parity within the animation industry. With a major disparity between male and female talent across the global creative industries still present, we'll be discussing the barriers of entry and what we can do to ensure representation across the animation space. I'll be chatting to Adrianna Cohen, SVP and Global Head of Production at Mikros, Sabine Heller, Global Head of Character Rigging and Animation at Mikros, and Aurelia Abate, Executive Producer at Mikros. Thank you all for joining us today. Let's kick off with a few intros. I would love to go around the room and have you all tell me a little bit about yourselves, your role at Mikros Animation, and how you got into the animation industry. Sabine, let's kick off with you.
All right. Well, my name is Sabine Heller, and I'm the Global Head of Character Animation and Rigging at Mikros Animation. I have been working in this relatively newly created global role at Mikros since last April. And what I do is I basically work with all of the character departments on all shows in all three of our locations in Paris, Montreal, and Bangalore. And with those teams, I help maintain and increase the consistency and the quality, but it's also, part of my job is also improving and aligning, the technical, creative, and structural approaches where it makes sense only though. And I also look into, what can we do for current and future development, improvements, and needs for creating characters. And when it comes to, how I got into the industry, I was born and raised in Germany. And when I came out of school, I actually had no connection whatsoever to the animation industry. And I did know, though, that I loved computers, I loved art, and I really loved watching animation. So I was really studying something that was kind of related. And, at that point in time in the 2000s, web design was big. So I was in an undergraduate program that was more focused on programming and project management and web design. But, I thought, okay, I love tech, I love computers, and I love design. And I really love animation. And that for me was like, hey, why don't I do 3D animation? And at that point, I was like, okay, I'm going to learn this on my own at home on the weekends. There was a time where there were no hey, let's get the student version from the software, or hey, let's just download this tutorial. That just didn't exist at that point. So I bought a book and I sat down and I went through all those things that I wanted to learn. And I got a student job at a research institute where I actually could use an SGI workstation at that point and learn Maya, which was super cool. And that's when I kind of knew, okay, this is fun, I love this. And from there on, I decided I need to go to LA. LA was for me, that's where stuff happens. And I applied for an internship, and actually over 100 companies sent out emails because I knew, I had to kind of go strongly because I didn't have any connection. And one company, Gentle Giant Studios, basically offered me an internship, which was great. And that's where it kind of started. From there on, I went back to Germany, finished my studies. Then I went to New York again, studied there for a little while, went back to Germany again, worked there in my first job at a small studio in advertising. And then I moved back to New York for my longest job at Blue Sky Studios. I was there for 12 years. And then last year, I started my new adventure at Mikros Animation. So that's pretty much it. So my background is pretty much in really hands-on rigging, but now what I'm doing is just much more focused on a little bit more manager role. But I'm still, this passion that brought me in it, that's still what drives me today.
Wow, I'm sure there are a lot of self-taught animators and CG artists and developers listening to this who will absolutely love that story, knowing that you don't have to go through a traditional path to always get into the role that you're looking for. Adrianna, how about you?
My name is Adrianna Cohen. I am the global head of production for Mikros Animation. That means that I am in charge of, Mikros currently has 7 feature films, 9 episodics that are done in 3 studios around the world. And making sure all those films are working smoothly, making sure our clients are getting what we want, looking out for challenges in the future and helping overcome those challenges are kind of under my umbrella. Production is a very interesting section of the animation field because there is nothing that production doesn't touch or have influence over, because absolutely everything comes back down to what is the quota rate? How is everybody doing? Are people happy with the output? What can we do to make things better? I see production as the foundation to animation, to holding it up and helping it go forward. How did I start? I started as someone who always wanted to be in the film business. First, I went into live action. As a very young child, it's all I ever wanted to do. When we lived in Canada, as in my high school years, I convinced the local TV station to let me work at that TV station. And I would get up at 4 a.m. and ride my bicycle over TV station and open the TV station and get things up and running and carry. Back then, now you're going to know how old I am. Back then, the film was on huge, heavy reels, and I'd have to carry it and put it onto a machine, the commercials onto a machine, and and then learn to do the telecine and all that stuff and throw things up. And it was a great experience. And then we moved back to New York, and at the time, the only 3 schools I was willing to consider for film school were NYU, UCLA, and USC. And the only one of those which I could afford that had a Division I football team was UCLA. So I went there, because I wasn't going to give up, cheering for the football team. So that was a big part of it. And, from there I went into editing, went into stunt driving, went into acting, went into everything that ended up producing and being the vice president of production for New Line. From there, I moved back to New York and did some freelance work with corporations, and then worked for a company called McKinsey & Company, which is a consulting firm, one of the largest. And in that company, I did over 400 animated shorts. I did over 3,000 videos, but over my tenure with them, but 400 animated shorts, which I did with the studios around the world. So when Andrea wanted to hire me to come in, Andrea Millaro, who's the president of Mikros Animation, who then was the president of Blue Sky, hired me to come in to help revamp some of the processes at Blue Sky. She felt that this was a place that had been around a long time and kind of got stuck in how they were doing things and wanted to rethink. So I came into Blue Sky with the notion of thinking of what would I do there? How could I take everything I've learned over the years, live action, as well as making all those shorts, to help rethink how the animation studio was structured. As we started to do that, Disney bought Blue Sky, and that project was put on hold. So now we're at Mikros trying to do the same thing, trying to rethink animation, trying to rethink how to best do what we do to create an environment that's safe for artists and, productive and fun for everyone.
Wow, stunt driving. That's an incredibly interesting career path. I love it. And finally, Aurelia, tell me a bit about yourself.
Yes, hi. So my name is Aurelia Abate. I'm an executive producer at Mikros Animation in Paris. I've been with Mikros for 2 years now, and I've been hired to take care of a big feature film we're doing for Paramount. And as the executive producer, I'm in charge of, making sure that this movie is delivered on budget, on time, that our clients are happy, and that we have the, a happy team of 200 50 plus artists, and that, everything is going as smoothly as possible. So it's really exciting. It's really, it's a really demanding and committing job, but we're having a lot of fun because, as Adrianna was saying, production is really dealing with a lot of different topics, from just, taking care of the humans to figuring out budget, problem solving every day, and making sure that we give the clients and the directors what they are imagining, that we're putting all this on screen within our resources and with what we can afford to do. I've been a producer for a long time, 20 years. I started when I was 15, same thing. I was like, okay, I want to work in movies because I just love going to the theater. I'm very much a feature film and movie lover. When I was 15, I didn't know what was the different, jobs in movies. So I started looking at, besides acting, because I knew I was a really bad actress. So that was like, let's forget about that. And then I knew I wasn't really an artist either, but I was, starting to read about all the movie jobs. And I thought that producer was a wonderful job because you have to take care of artists and you go and you help them, just deliver the story to the audience. My first job was in animation. It was in 98. I worked for a TV channel, a network in France, and we were doing 2D TV, animated TV series for kids. And I just loved the atmosphere in all the animation studios. We had it was big kids eating candies and drawing on papers and having their dogs in the studio. And it was just playful and nice. And all the people I worked with at the time were really, really sweet. And then I wanted to do a movie school, and my dad told me, okay, but you have to do the best school in the world. So like Adrianna, it was NYU, USC, UCLA, and I went to UCLA as well. Yay! Go Bruins! So I did the film school at UCLA, the producers program, and when I got out, I met a visual effects company based in France, a studio they was just super talented, and they were doing amazing VFX work on American movies. So they hired me because I spoke English, basically, and that's how I started in visual effects. And I spent, 18 years in visual effects. And when I was in animation, I just fell in love with all the artists working on, in CG on those computers, and they are just super nice people, totally passionate by their work, and I just decided to stick with them. I didn't want to go and produce my own live action movies, or I just wanted to stick with the CG world. And so that's how I came back to animation after a few years in VFX.
You touched on something really interesting there, which is also one of the reasons I love working in this industry, is that it's incredibly playful, and we work with so many incredible artists and technologists, and it's a really stimulating environment to be in, whether you're in a creative role or not. So I 100% agree with that. So we've got 3 incredibly successful women in animation here, but it's historically been an incredibly male-dominated industry. Looking back over the last decade, how has gender parity within the animation industry evolved, or perhaps not evolved? And do you think we're moving in the right direction? Adrianna?
I feel it's definitely evolved. Probably easily being the oldest here on the call. It's definitely changed a lot since I started. It needs to continue to change. And I think the new generation of artists that are coming up are a completely different group of people that are creating such a different environment for women to be in. Having said that, though, it is still very challenging for women to move up in this business, simply because people tend to want to work with people who are like them, or, some thinking needs to change, or a bunch of things need to happen. But we're definitely moving in the right direction, though.
Unconscious bias is a huge part of it. Why do you think animation has been such a male-dominated industry in the past, aside from the fact that people tend to hire people who look like them?
In my opinion, and Sabine can speak to this more because she is one of the few people who are in an actually male-dominated part of the male-dominated industry. But unconscious bias in terms of animation, as well as a lot of things in the media business to start with, are essentially built on things, right? So animation and CG were built on computers, and computers were often classes that women didn't take or women didn't focus on, or if they did, they didn't make a career out of it. They stopped at a certain point, or they went into advertising maybe. I haven't studied the paths of women who actually took the classes in college. I'm going to leave that answer to Sabina, but what I have seen is that there is a belief that women can't do math. Women aren't very good at technical things. I know for myself, people are often surprised at my understanding of technology and my ability to problem solve on that level. And I don't think they'd be surprised if I was a guy. I don't believe that would be the case at all. But that doesn't matter, right? So we continue to surprise until it becomes normal. And then it goes away.
Sabine, you're in quite a tech-facing role, and traditionally there are a lot more women in production roles than there are in artist roles. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I mean, definitely one thing is also to say is that animation has a history of gendered division of labor, meaning that actually there were hiring practices that potentially influenced the access of women to certain occupations. So, for example, if we think about Disney, which we can probably call one of the first commercial feature animation studio, and in the 30s, 40s, women were actually not hired as character animators. So that was something that immediately, basically there was no way for them to get in at that point. They were only employed in what they had at that point, the ink and paint department, and they even worked spatially separated from men. And this occupation was actually not considered creative and much less prestigious. And interesting enough too, at that point there were no animation schools how we know it today, where you could go and start learning it. So the access was very limited. And Disney actually had one of those first training programs. I mean, they were still exploring things at that point. So they had their own ways of learning and training at the studio. But since women were not allowed actually to become character animators, they were also not allowed in those programs. So they just had few chances to learn that trade. So that's, and I'm not saying that this explains everything, but it is something where it sets a certain path. And there's definitely a potential that had a long-term effect. Of course, now we have we evolved in a lot of ways, and I agree we have become much better in this area. However, just speaking as somebody that is comes from a relatively technical field, and also currently I'm looking and working a lot with technology and future developments. So sometimes I'm in meetings with people that are all men. And I'm leading the meeting because it's a very technical meeting, but we don't have that many women in there. And that's still the case. So I think we, as Adrianna said, we still have a lot of work to do to make that better.
Adrianna, you touched on something really important, which is internal culture and the environment within which women can operate in the workplace. Aurelia, you've been in production for 20 years now. What are some of the changes that you've seen over the past 2 decades in terms of the perhaps changing internal culture?
I've seen an evolution for sure. 20 years ago, when I was working in the VFX industry in Paris, it was only the artists were all male. There was no woman. I think mostly because in France you have to choose your career path quite young, when you're 17 or 18, and then in engineering schools or computer schools there is like this thinking of that it's not made for girls. You know, when you're 16, you're 17, you don't feel like, even if you like math or physics, you don't feel like it's, you know, it's the right path to go. So I think that's why. And at the time also, I think all the pioneers of CG images, they are guys who love like gore movies and making explosions and building their own monsters and doing stuff in their garage, you know, and it's a more male activity, more male activities than women activities, I would say. But that was 20 years ago. Since then, we have much more women as artists in the studios. I can see that. And we have finally some supervisors at like those level of positions. Now we have women, but it's still quite rare. It's a minority in comparison to male, that's for sure. Why is that? I think it's like in other industries. I would say it's when it's really time-consuming jobs. At some point, women they are asked to make choices. Do you want to commit fully and work 60 hours a week, or do you want to have time to have a kid and build a family? You know, and I don't think that the studios led by male or men are not going to think about offering something else or finding another solution for women, because they just, you know, we're not having the same. I don't think they don't want to do it. I think they don't think about doing it for women. You know what I mean? But in a few years ago, it was really interesting. I had an artist came to me and said, I need to take a paternity leave because I'm having a baby. So now my hours are going to be 9 to 6 and I need to leave at 6 and I want to take 2 months off, you know, and it was a guy coming and asking for that, which it was the first time it happened to me. Before it was women, they would always come and say, okay, I'm going to have a baby. Can I adjust my hours? And men are starting to do that. And I think that's really interesting. And maybe it's coming from the society. It's coming from, you know, some rules now that, you know, we are asking them to take paternity leaves. They have the right to take them. So I think it's both coming from outside the society and the men themselves asking. And then, of course, I mean, the past 20 years, women, I think the change in women's being, you know, feeling they can ask more, they can, you know, of course, the Me Too movement and all this is freeing the, you know, women to ask also and say, okay, this is not okay for me. I want to do this job, but you have to help me and allow me to do it my way.
It's interesting. I've been hearing from a lot of recruiters that there is a lot more diversity within entry-level roles and within the university courses or college courses that are surrounding this industry. But to your point, Aurelia, it doesn't really translate to those senior roles and those supervisor roles or executive producer roles. And there is a massive societal pressure associated with that when it comes to people that may want to start families and maternity leave in, let's say, the US versus the UK and how that would affect one's career. What do you think businesses, and not just in the animation industry, but in the wider industry at large, what do you think businesses can do to cultivate a more accommodating culture for women in the workplace?
Yeah, I first of all, it's really important for it to be understood that women aren't men. Right. So and men may want to do this too, but and we're speaking in really broad generalities. So forgive me to all the people who are listening, but playing on those for a second, it's really important for a distinction to be made that, you know, there may be some women out there, you know, who are going to start and want children. There are some that don't and some that doesn't fall, but some it does happen. And so several things that you have to do to support that, right? You have to decide this person is important enough for me to create a culture which they can leave and come back and not lose time, right? There's an arc to someone's career and it has to be okay for them to go and come back and not feel like they fell behind or lost some time in doing that. We also have to be able to be willing to acknowledge that when both men and women have a child, their perspectives are going to change, of priorities are going to change for a few years. But in addition, those are kind of the broad surface things that everybody looks at. In addition, there's something really important, and that is there's perspective differences, right? So when you have a problem and you're solving the problem, a lot of the reason people tend to hire people who look like them and think like them is because they want the answer to their question to be the same, right? They want to solve the problems in the way they solve them. When you add different diversities to that mix, it's not just women. It's people who come from different cultural backgrounds. It's people who come from different places. You're going to get different solutions to your problems. And that in some ways is great, but it also broadens how long it takes to figure out the solution. And the industries we are set up in are all about quick answers, right? So it becomes a complex situation to say, so-and-so is really considerate of how everybody's thinking. And they really, really want to go out there and interview everybody and get everybody's opinion before we do this solve. But we have to do this by Friday. So how are we going to do that, right? And that could be a gender thing, that could be a cultural thing, that could be an anything, right? So it means that business itself needs to think of itself more organically and needs to start looking at itself as we need to become something more spontaneous and something more receptive to the different opportunities out there, because we need different answers. So part of that is we need to approach those answers in different ways.
You've touched on some really striking differences between the male and female experience within the industry, be that getting into the industry or exploring their career path. Sabine, you recently finished a PhD thesis that unsurprisingly found there were notable differences between men and women of the animation production process. But more surprisingly, most women were very hesitant to link those differences to gender. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, and it was actually a quite interesting discovery. And it is difficult to say for sure, but one thing I do want to point out is also that women saw the possibility of gender inequality. It was just a very delicate topic. And I think it is because our industry has the reputation to be, very fun. It's a cool environment. We don't have, this is not the regular office job, right? This is a fun, cool environment. And there was actually another study that found that this makes speaking about gender inequality more difficult, as nobody wants to appear difficult or spoil the party, to basically say it like that. And our industry also has this reputation, because we are new, hip, and cool. There is we look at talent. We look at making sure that the people, it's a very meritocratic system that people believe in. There's confidence in that. But, this is really interesting. There's always this thing that is being said. We only look at the reel. We don't look at the name on the reel. And you know what? Yes, to a certain degree that's true. But at the end, there's always a CV, right? A resume. There's always an interview. And we are very much relying in this industry on networking. So basically, and that plays into what Adrianna was saying. And I think it's also used as a risk reduction strategy, because, we ask, who do you know? Who's reliable? Who's good? Who do you like? Who did you like to work with? And then, you get those recommendations. And that in itself is not discriminatory, right? This is basically what people do and recommend. But the interesting thing is, and that's what Adrianna was saying, we tend to hire in our own image. And if the image in the animation industry is primarily white and male, then we might be, unknowingly reinforce the current status.
That phrase, "we don't want to be difficult," I think rings so true, especially when it comes to some of the harder conversations one might have in business, such as with negotiation. And Adrianna, I remember we had a conversation not long ago wherein we talked about the challenges facing women who wanted to take some time off to have a family. And there is a decision often that needs to be made on who earns the most money and can afford to take the time off work. And that's in all industries. There's no secret that there is often a lot of disparity between male and female salaries. And I heard from a 2D artist, actually, she told me that she had experienced very different negotiation styles between men and women when they were asking for a raise or compensation or anything for that matter. Do you think societally women have been conditioned to be conflict averse and approach these negotiations less aggressively than men, leading them to, and this is definitely for want of a better phrase, settle for less?
Yeah, without a doubt. Aurelia, weren't you telling me you were talking to a friend who was negotiating? This may not, forgive me. My memory goes as to who gave me this information. They were approached by a friend. They were in negotiation for a job. And their boyfriend, they had a number they wanted to hit. And their boyfriend just said, ask for the number. Just ask for the number. The worst that can happen is they could say no. And that never, ever occurred to this woman, that she should just go in the negotiation and ask for what she wanted. Never occurred to her. Whereas I have to tell you, I negotiate, all the time. It doesn't, I've seen mostly men come into situations where they're completely unqualified, have absolutely no qualms about asking not only for the job, but for the most money they could possibly get in the job, and it always makes me tilt my head. And I never hold judgment against them. I just wonder why we can't do that. Why don't we do that? And I've seen it happen a lot. And oftentimes when I'm negotiating with women, I will tell them behind the scenes, ask for more. Come on. What are you doing? When I went into Blue Sky and I did an analysis of the salaries of Blue Sky, I was appalled. The women were paid on average 25% less or 30% less than all the men. And, and bringing them up to scale was a huge undertaking.
I think that after centuries of hearing, you cannot do that. You don't have access to this. It's in our subconscious that we have always to prove that we are worth it and that we can do the work, and we have to be super prepared before going to an interview. While a guy would just go because he thinks he can do it, that's it, because his mom told him you're the best, I don't know what our mom told us, but...
But I think there's something else there too, because I think that, there are certain expectations and even maybe stereotypical personality traits associated with women and men, and those are influenced by society. So I think this can also make it very difficult for women to act opposite to the traditional female identity, since that actually could maybe cause a negative reaction. So for example, if, like being confident, assertive and aggressive, that's kind of something of a positive characteristic for male behavior. But for a woman, I think there's the risk that this might have a negative connotation because it goes against this gendered expectation.
Oh, without a doubt. I will tell you, the only reason I am permitted, I'm often called a bullet to the brain. And I will say, flat out the truth and be very direct in almost every conversation. And the only reason I think I am able to do that is because I have a boss who understands that and gives me the latitude to do that, right? So another female is giving me permission to take this on. But I startle almost every conversation I'm in. And the beginning of meeting me, almost everybody goes back to, the person who's my supervisor and says, I'm not saying she's wrong, but can she say it differently? And that never happens to anybody else,
Can she say it nicer, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I have worked, or I do have female friends who are incredibly successful in business and have been told they are a little too strong or they come off a little too aggressive when they're simply, as you say, Adrianna, speaking directly. And I think having the latitude from those that work with us to be able to communicate in that way is really fantastic. And I've actually really appreciated not just my female role models, but really strong male role models that appreciate that part about me as well, and don't look to dull that sensibility. I'd love to turn to the creative aspect of animation for a moment and talk about representation within the craft itself. Do you think the way creative content represents women has improved or changed over the years? I'm the stark example that comes to mind is the contrast between, let's say, Jessica Rabbit many years ago and modern day sort of animated epics that are really embracing diverse stories, such as Encanto, for instance.
I think there has been definitely made an effort to improve representation within animation and maybe a film in general. I read in a study, and that comes out, I think, every year, the Jane Report, which is by the Gina Davis Institute of Gender and Media. And it's really interesting because you do see it, female leads and co-leads in popular children's television increased substantially over the past decade. So that's there. But I also have to say this is also a study for live action and animation, so it includes all of that. But I think we're still far away from other areas too. I think we need to, and not only women, I think we need to show more LGBTQ characters of color in lead and supporting roles, older characters, I think we're also still lacking there, and different body types. I think it's actually interesting because I always look at that. And I work a lot with clients and with the design team, and we work, for example, also on the world, right? Populating the world with BG characters. And that is something a little bit of, I feel very strongly about, because I want to make sure this is a world that, it represents a diversity, right? So for me, it's always like about, asking the questions to the clients, do we have a good variety of body types? Is this kind of a good diversity? How is it looking? Do we only have male characters that we design? Maybe we should make sure we have female characters. Do they all have to look very gender stereotypical, or can we do this a little bit more differently? Because we don't conform to that in the real world. So, or do all the women have to wear high heels? Those kind of things as well. So this is something I always feel strongly about, and I think it has improved, but it's still something we just have to continue. It's a continuous effort.
You've just reminded me of the M&M's controversy in the US. They took the heels of one of the M&M's and put her in sneakers, and everyone was up in arms about it. It's interesting as well, you noted that you often say to the people you're working with, is this as diverse and representational as it could be, and not that the briefs are make sure this is as diverse and representational as it should be.
But I think also it depends on the writers, on the people creating the stories. Like, it feels to me for animation that often they're targeting the audience. They're targeting an audience, or they want to tell a certain story, and then they will get the characters that go with it. You know what I mean? Like, they did the Kirikou series. It's really, really beautiful feature films, and it's an African tale, so you have all African characters in it, and it's great. But because it's a certain type of, it's a choice, right, to tell these mythical tales. And then now we're doing a movie that's this. The target is the Asian market, so we're gonna put Asian characters in it. But I think there is not a lot of diversity less in animation than in live action features now. I think it's really led by the story or the target or the market you're targeting.
It's really interesting.
That's my feeling. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know, but it feels like you're writing for a purpose. And then Disney was always about the princess story. So all the women characters are princesses, and we love them. They're great. And the villains are, black hair women, and the nice girls are blonde, all those stereotypes. I think that those are changing, though. I think that those are changing.
So it looks like from a creative standpoint, we have a long way to go there, but slowly but surely things are starting to change.
Yeah, it still comes down to, it really comes down to the people making the choices, always, right? It's not a flat on top. It's always, at this moment, it's still a hierarchy, and the hierarchy starts with one person's sensibilities on top and where they go down to and who they're influenced by. So, if you look at the head of a studio and, and they represent a certain demographic, there's a really good chance that the movies coming out of there are going to be representative of the teams underneath them. There are very few studio execs that have a diverse group of people underneath. I will do a shout out for something I think Netflix did well, and that is when they open in a market in, another country, they allow that country to make a certain amount of content that then gets uploaded onto Netflix, and you have the opportunity to finally see things that are diverse from different places. But, that model, that business model is a very difficult model for any studio to take on.
Before we wrap up, I would love to ask you all how you think we can encourage women listening to explore careers in the animation space. Aurelia, let's kick off with you.
That's a tough question. I think we need, they need role models like Sabine. I'm thinking really about artists because I think in production we have a lot of women actually. And I think we have a lot of women in production because you start as a PA or coordinator. It's more like an assistant job, and you have to be really good at details oriented and organized and all this. And usually we think about women to do those jobs. So I think there is discrimination there because we have really good men coordinators as well. But we don't hire them. We would hire women instead. So for artists, attracting more women artists in the industry, I think Sabine's, people like Sabine's being role models is really important. So talking about it, showing what she's doing, teaching the younger kids what animation is, and that the technology shouldn't be a barrier. That it's there is a lot of creativity behind. So I would say, communication at school level, and showing what people like Sabine are doing.
I think one thing that the men do really well, and that is they bring up each other. They support each other and they bring each other up. And I think women are often very excited to be part of something that they don't often think of. They have a responsibility for the women behind them or around them to do that. I think that's gotten a little bit better, but I think we can do that better as a unit. I think we need to look at the women who came before us with a lot of gratitude because they literally walked into rooms and took an awful lot of crap for doing it, and took a lot of hits. And I think we need to give them our not only gratitude, but a lot of grace for opening those doors and reaching out to them, not just for mentorship, but for thanks, I think would be great. I do believe that there are things like women in animation and stuff like that, but we should get to the point where we feel okay bonding in various institutions, going out for dinner, supportive of each other, without feeling awkward by singling ourselves out, which is often what I hear from women. Oh, I don't want to be part of that kind of club. But it's important to. It's important to be there to support it. It's important to have dinner. It's important to be okay to do that. And I think it's really important for us to look backwards and make sure that the path we're leaving is a path that can be followed.
Sabine, do you have anything to add before we wrap?
For me, I totally agree with what Aurelia and Adrianna were saying. I do think that it's really important that we have role models and that we can inspire women to see that a career is achievable. And that can happen when you see women, you see that they have been doing this. I actually really love teaching. So I taught a lot. Now, unfortunately, I don't have so much time anymore, but it was always really, really nice to talk to all students, but also giving, students and female students something to look to that they are like, okay, I can do this. I can do the tech. And the tech is fun because sometimes that's also a thing, I'm sometimes not 100% sure, I think it's a mix of a lot of things, but if you don't see a lot of women in one field or one specific occupation, then sometimes it can also be a deterrent, right? I think and it's interesting because Aurelia said this, because it can sometimes go the other way, right? For example, in nurses, right? That's a very female domain. But that makes it hard for a man to maybe want to be a nurse and has to face possible, backlash or stereotypes in that area, which is so this goes across, right? This is not one way only. And so I do think that it's important that to not reinforce some of those gendered stereotypes. And I think that can be done by also what Adrianna was saying, having mentorships, and it is that women find a large amount of opportunities through other women. And I think that's really important. And that way we can make sure that we don't, end up in that slowly expanding who we hire, and that, we make sure we do this consciously and be aware of it.
And I think also, if I can just add one thing, I think within the companies itself, we have to make sure that women can be themselves, that they don't feel like they have to behave like men, and that them being a woman is respected and is bringing something to the table, and that we're welcoming them. So everybody feels good at the studio and everybody has fun. So more women wants to come and they don't want to leave, and they just want to pursue their career and bring their friends, as Sabine was saying, or Adrianna was saying.
Well, I really appreciate your insights today. We are recording this podcast on International Women's Day, so it feels like a very appropriate conversation to be having. Adrianna, Aurelia, Sabine, thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If you're interested in exploring any of the ideas you heard today, please get in touch with the Technicolor Creative Studios team via any one of our studio websites or email beyondimagination@technicolor.com. Today's podcast was produced by Line Studios, led by executive producer Becca Falborn. You can follow Line Studios on all platforms at limestudios.tv. Thank you to all of our guests and to you for tuning in to Beyond Imagination.